Hello and welcome to this session where we'll be discussing the Procore integration with Sage 100 Contractor. My name is Derek Long and I'm an integration implementation specialist here at Procore. Now, before we start, I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of a background on myself. I work for Procore now and I have for the last almost 6 years in my current role as an integration implementation specialist. So, in my current role, I help to implement, train, and I support customers who are using the Procore and Sage 100 integration. So, prior to Procore, I worked at Sage for almost 9 years in the Beaverton, Oregon office. So, I think that's enough about me. So, let's go ahead and get started. In our session today, we'll start by giving a brief introduction to what Procore is in case anyone here is unfamiliar with our product lines, and then we'll start talking about why Procore created an integration with Sage. Then I'll also talk a little bit about the partnerships that have been made to make the integration with both Sage 300 CRE and Sage 100 Contractor possible. Then we'll take a high level look at the feature sets included with our Sage 100 integration. And once we have a good idea of the integration points, I'll open up Procore and demonstrate a few features of the integration so you can all get an idea of the look and feel of how the integration functions. Finally, I'll provide a little bit of insight into the features that are currently being worked on for each integration so you'll have an idea of how those feature set maps we're going to look at will be evolving over time. So, what benefits does the integration with the Sage products provide? So, first and foremost, this integration allows you to use Procore and all of its cloud based construction management tools and features while integrating with your Sage ERP system for the finance and accounting aspects. So, by having these two systems linked, you will save time and labor by streamlining the process of time sensitive tasks such as getting commitments and commitment change orders from the field into your accounting system. With an integrated system, you'll also see a big reduction in human error as this has eliminated the need for manual double entry when transferring data from Procore to Sage. We'll discuss the different features included with the integration in just a moment, but for the areas that are integrated, you'll be able to enter information in Procore and have it synced to the Sage accounting system. No more entering of things like budgets, commitments, and cost information in two different places. Once your Procore site and Sage 100 system are synchronized, we'll bring a lot of the valuable accounting information from your ERP system to the Procore platform, giving your project managers and field staff more visibility to things like job to date cost, cost of completion, which will also aid in their decision making out on the job site. So, our partnership with Sage is really what makes this whole integration possible. So, back around 2015, Procore partnered up with HH2, who was already a development partner with Sage, to build the initial feature set for the Sage 300 CRE integration, which was originally just focused on cost management. So, HH2 is essentially the middleware, or kind of the man in the middle, if that's what you want to call it. So, that's who we use to make the integration with Sage 100 possible. Okay, and so HH2 sits in the middle of everything and it facilitates the flow of data between Procore and Sage. Now, customers who purchase the integration are provided with a license for HH2, and our team of implementation specialists at Procore will assist new customers in installing and configuring HH2 for use with Procore. Now, if you're already an HH2 customer, we can actually piggyback off of your existing license for use with the Procore integration. While we are partnered with HH2, the solution is fully supported by our ERP team here at Procore. So this includes any type of customer issues that you may run into. Now, more recently, at our 2018 Groundbreak conference, we announced official partnership with Sage. Now, we were able to build a pretty solid integration with Sage 300 with the help of HH2, but there were just many features that we wanted to add to the integration that just would not have been possible without the partnership of Sage. And so, by having this partnership, We were able, with the Sage 300 CRE product, we were able to add in new features like prime contracts, prime contract change order tools, and it also allowed us to build an integration with Sage 100 Contract, which was not available prior to this partnership. So at the time of this recording, we've actually implemented nearly 300 Sage 100 Contractor customers, and we also have more in the process of implementation currently. So here we're looking at our feature set map between Sage 100 Contractor and Procore. So let's just talk about some of the features that are included with the integration. Now, in some cases, you'll see that our integration is bidirectional or two-way, meaning not only are we able to push information from Procore to Sage 100, but we're also able to pull information from Sage 100 Contractor into Procore. For example, projects can be created in Procore and exported to Sage 100. However, projects can also be created in Sage 100 and imported into Procore. This means you can continue to use the workflow that works best for your company. So in other words, if you'd prefer to create your projects in Sage, you can continue to do so and then import the job into Procore when you're ready. So with our integration, not only are we pushing or pulling information to and from Sage 100 as I just described, we're also adding a layer of data validation and error handling for any information that's going to be sent from Procore to Sage. So for example, we're able to verify things like job IDs when pushing information over to Sage. If you try to use a job ID that's already being used in Sage 100, we'll provide an error to let you know that a different job ID is needed before the information can be exported. Now, looking back at the feature set map, we're also able to take any phases that have been created in Sage 100 and pull them into Procore. You'll notice the arrow only goes from Sage to Procore, so that means your phases must be created in Sage 100 and then pulled into Procore. Our next feature integrates your Procore companies together with your Sage AP vendors. This is another area of the integration where you see bidirectional or two-way integration. You can create companies in Procore and send them to Sage as AP vendors, or you can create your account payable vendors in Sage and pull them into Procore. Next up is we have budgets. If you've been using Sage 100 Contractor for a long time and prefer to create your budget in Sage, you can continue to do so and then import the budget into Procore when you're ready. Or if you prefer, there's a budget tool in Procore you can use to record the budget and then export it to Sage 100 Contractor. Again, we wanted to create an integration that's as flexible as possible in as many areas as possible. Now, once your Sage vendor records are linked to company records in Procore, you can use those company records in Procore to create subcontracts and purchase orders that can then be pushed down to Sage. Now, you may have noticed this feature does not show the arrow going the other way, as we only support commitments being pushed from Procore to Sage 100 Contractor. Now, commitment change orders will work in the same fashion as commitments. Commitment change orders are created in Procore and pushed over to Sage 100. Finally, one of the most powerful features of the integration is the accounting information we're able to pull from Sage 100 Contractor into Procore. We're able to pull in your job-to-date cost information from Sage, and the information will be displayed on your Procore budget. So for now, let's get into Procore so I can show you how some of these features work. Here I am in my Procore demo company, and in order to get to the part of the software where I can control the integration, I need to click on Company Tools, ERP Integrations. So you can think of ERP integrations as where you're going to go to control everything that goes to and from Sage 100 Contractor. Okay, so as this loads, the very first thing you're going to see here when you go into ERP integrations is you're going to see your standard cost codes and cost types. So with the integration, we actually pull in your standard cost code list from Sage 100 Contractor along with the cost types. So in my dummy company here, all of my cost codes are listed below, And up top, I have my different cost types from Sage 100 Contractor. So the reason why we pull in your cost codes and cost types from Sage 100 Contractor, this is what gives you the ability to create projects in Procore and then export them over to Sage 100 Contractor. Because in order for that to happen, the projects have to be using the Sage 100 cost code list. Now you'll also notice these little check boxes here. These little check boxes are used to set up default cost code and cost type combinations in Procore. So let's say, for example, general requirements. So if every single time I add this cost code to a project, if I know that I always use certain cost types like other, labor, or subcontract, then it makes sense for me to come in here and check these off. So what this will do is every single time I add this cost code to a project in Procore, it's also going to add in the default cost types that I've checked off here. Now that can potentially save you a little bit of time as you're creating your projects in Procore, because in order for any project in Procore to go over to Sage, each cost code on the project must contain at least one cost type. So in other words, for every cost code you have on the project in Procore, you must have at least one cost type selected for it. So again, this could potentially save you a little bit of time. Now, since we bring in your cost codes from Sage 100 Contractor, if you want to add any new cost codes or make any changes to the description, you'll make those changes in Sage. And as part of our automated syncing with HH2, that new cost code that you've added to Sage should show up in this list within 30 minutes or less. Now, you may notice this big orange button on the right-hand side called Sync Cost Codes and Cost Types. This is a way for you to perform an on-demand sync. So let's say you've added a new cost code into Sage 100 and it's been at least 10 minutes. So as long as it's been at least 10 minutes, you could come in here, click Sync Cost Codes and Cost Types. That's going to perform an on-demand sync. Okay, so again, if you do nothing at all, if you add a new cost code into Sage 100 Contractor, it will get pulled into Procore within 30 minutes or less. But again, if you don't want to wait the full 30 minutes, you can come here and click Sync Cost Codes and Cost Types. Okay, so next up is we have vendors. Now with your vendors, we've also pulled in your account payable list from Sage 100 Contractor. And as you can see here, if we look at what I've highlighted, this is letting us know the vendor list that I'm looking at right now only exists in Sage 100 Contractor. So these vendors are not officially part of Procore yet. Okay, so there's a few different things you can actually do with this vendor list. Okay, so let's say that you have a company here in this list, and let's say you know for a fact you have not added this company to Procore yet. So if you want to add this company to Procore, it's really as simple as coming over here and clicking Add to Procore. Okay, so this green success message lets me know this company has been added to my Procore directory. Over on the right-hand side, we also have a synced list. So this is going to give you a list of companies that are synced between Sage 100 and Procore. And so if I've made a mistake and I should not have synced a particular company, like there's the company I just synced, Centennial Excavation, I could come here and I could click Unlink. Clicking Unlink is going to sever the tie between Procore and Sage 100 Contractor for that particular company. Now, let's say that you've added a few companies to Procore already. In that case, over on the right-hand side, we have this little checkbox that says Show Suggested Procore Matches. So if I click on this, this is going to go out and it's going to try and find a match or any matches between Sage 100 and Procore. And as you can see, it's found a match. And if I wanted to link the two companies together, I could just hit Link. So again, this is a way for you to sync an existing company in Procore together with an existing company in Sage 100 Contractor. What that will do for you is once your vendor records are synced, that is what allows you to sync your subcontracts and purchase orders over to Sage. So I'm going to uncheck this box. Now, just like with your standard cost codes and cost types, if you add a new vendor into Sage, it's going to show up in this list within 30 minutes or less. Okay, but just like before, if you don't want to wait that long, you can click the refresh vendor list. So as long as it's been at least 10 minutes since you've added that vendor to Sage, if you click this button, this will perform an on-demand sync to pull that vendor into Procore without having to wait the full 30 minutes. You'll also notice there are a bunch of red X's to the right of each vendor. Those red X's are used to archive vendors. So let's say you have a vendor in your list that you know you're never ever going to write a subcontractor purchase order to. So if I'm looking at this list, like there's Hoffman Bank here, I'm probably never going to write a subcontractor purchase order to my bank. So if I know that, then I can come over here to the right-hand side and I can click the red X to archive the vendor in this list. Now it doesn't touch the vendor whatsoever in Sage 100, it only archives it in this list in Procore. And as you guessed it, on the right-hand side, we do have an archived filter. So I'm going to click on this, and this is going to show me a list of all of the companies that I've archived. And so there's my company that I've archived, and if I made a mistake, I can just hit unarchive, and it's going to add it back to the list. Now, of course, with the integration, you can create companies in Procore and push them down to Sage 100 Contractor. To show you that, I'm going to go to my Ready to Export filter. So the big picture way to think about this is anything in Ready to Import is information that's ready to be pulled in from Sage 100 Contractor. Anything in Ready to Export is information that's been created in Procore and it's ready to be sent down to Sage 100 Contractor. Okay, so I'm looking at my vendor list, and this is a list of companies that I could potentially export over to Sage. Okay, so I'm looking at my list here, and here's a company, LG headquarters, that I could potentially send over to Sage 100 Contractor. Now, you'll notice that there's a reject option, an accept option, and an export to Sage 100. Now, with the integration, we have an additional level of permission within Procore, and so only authorized people will officially be able to send anything from Procore down to Sage. So the main thinking behind that is within Procore, you can actually invite other companies to collaborate with you on your projects, but obviously you don't want those people having the ability to push stuff to your accounting system. So this is a way to only allow authorized people to officially send anything from Procore to Sage. So basically, before anything goes over to Sage, it has to go through this approval process. And so only authorized people will even see the reject option or the accept option or export to Sage. So if I'm the so-called accounting approver here, and I think, you know what, this is missing a city, I can choose reject. I can enter the reason why I'm rejecting this. I can say missing city, and then I can hit reject. If I hit reject, that's going to send an email notification to the person who sent this to be approved. Okay, so they're going to get an email notification and they're going to see the reason why you're rejecting it is missing city. So it's always a good idea to write the reason why you're rejecting the entry. However, if I think everything looks good, I would hit accept. I can choose a vendor type if I want. So if I'm a company that I really rely heavily on using vendor types in Sage 100 Contractor, I can pick the vendor type that I want this particular company to have. So I'll just kind of pick one here at random. Now, you do have to tell Sage what vendor ID you want this company to have when it goes over to Sage. Okay, now for those of you who are just used to letting Sage pick the next available vendor number, then it probably makes sense to continue to create your vendors in Sage and then just pull them into Procore. However, if you're one of those companies that gives vendors very specific vendor IDs, then certainly you could enter whatever vendor ID you want this company to have and then export to Sage. Now, the cool part about this is if you try to use a vendor ID that's already being used in Sage, it's going to give you an error. So it's letting you know the vendor ID has already been taken. So if I want to send this to Sage, I need to pick a different vendor ID that's not currently being used. So again, we find that most of our customers continue to create their vendors in Sage and pull them into Procore. However, you do have the opportunity to also create companies in Procore and then send them to Sage. Okay. So next up here, we'll talk about jobs. Now, just like with the vendor list that we just saw, the list of jobs that we're looking at here, these jobs only exist in Sage 100 Contractor. So again, you can kind of think of this as a holding area where you're going to decide which jobs you want to integrate between Sage and Procore. Okay, so the list that I'm looking at here, these jobs only exist in Sage 100 Contractor and they are not officially part of Procore yet. One word of caution: with the integration, you do not want to create the exact same project in both places. You either want to create your project in Procore or in Sage, but you do not want to create the same exact project in both places. Okay, so if I'm looking at my list here, this is where I'm going to decide what projects I actually want to pull into Procore. So if I'm looking at my list here, let's say I want to pull in this project, Emilio's Restaurant. If I want to add this project to Procore, I just simply click Add to Procore. All right, so this green success message lets me know this job has been successfully added to Procore. Over on the right-hand side, of course, we also have a synced filter. So this is going to show you which of your jobs have been synced between Sage and Procore. Also in Procore, I can go out and I can look at my portfolio list, which is going to show me all of my projects. So if I go out here and I'm in my portfolio list, there's Emilio's Restaurant that I just pulled into Procore. You'll notice the green banner. These green banners mean that the job has been synced between Sage and Procore. So this is a real quick and easy way to know which of your jobs are synced and which ones are not. Okay, so I'm going to go back out here and I'm going to go back to ERP integrations. And I'll click on jobs. Now, of course, with the integration, you can also create projects in Procore and push them over to Sage 100 Contractor. So for that, I'm going to go to my Ready to Export list. Okay. So here are 3 different projects that I've created that I could potentially send over to Sage. Here's my reject and accept options. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go out, I'm going to pull out my portfolio again. And I'm going to pull up a job. So this job, High Point Furniture Factory, I'm going to send this over to Sage. So I'm going to click on the project. Go to the admin settings for the project. And then I'm going to click on Send to ERP. So this is how you start the process of sending anything from Procore over to Sage. So it all starts with you clicking the Send to ERP button. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this. Okay, so notice that the button changed to Retrieve from ERP. So as long as this project is not officially synced with Sage yet, I could retrieve this if I wanted to add more information to it before I send this over to Sage. Okay, but let's just say everything is good. I'm going to go ahead and click Send to ERP again. Then I'm going to go back out to the company level in Procore, and then I'm going to go back into ERP integrations. All right, and I'm going to click on Jobs, and then Ready to Export. All right, so there's my job, High Point Furniture Factory. There's my reject and accept options. So again, if I think something is wrong, I can choose reject. If I think everything looks good, I would choose accept. I do need to tell Sage what job ID I want this to have in Sage. So again, if you're just used to letting Sage pick the next available job number, then again, it makes sense to continue to create your jobs in Sage and just pull them into Procore. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and enter a job ID here, and then I'm going to click Export to Sage 100. Okay, we see a message that the job has been successfully exported. Now, let's go take a look at that job in Sage. So here I am in my Sage 100 VM. So this is just kind of a dummy company that we have set up in Sage 100. And so I'm going to go to accounts receivable. I'm going to pull up jobs. Okay. All right, I'll scroll down. Okay, so there's the job that I just exported, High Point Furniture Factory. Okay. So here's how here's how we sent the job over to Sage. Now, obviously, in Procore, I didn't include the address or anything like that, just for the purpose of time here. So this is a job that has been successfully sent from Procore down to Sage. So I just wanted to show you what this looks like over on the Sage 100 side. Next, we'll click on Subjobs. Now, if you remember from the feature set map, uh, basically what we call subjobs is they're going to be your phases in Sage 100 Contractor. And if you remember, the arrow is just going in one direction from Sage to Procore. So this means if you create a phase in Sage 100 Contractor, we're capable of pulling that into Procore to create what Procore calls a subjobs. So, for example, there's the project that I just pulled into Procore, Emilio's Restaurant, and here's a phase that I created in Sage 100 Contractor. And so if I want to pull this particular phase into Procore, I just simply click Add to Procore. And this green success message lets me know it's been successfully added to Procore. So again, with your phases, you want to create them in Sage 100 Contractor and then pull them into Procore. So next up, we'll go to budgets. In Procore, now I'm looking at my budgets. Now remember, with the integration, you can either choose to create your budget in Procore and push it down to Sage, or you can create your budget in Sage 100 Contractor and pull it into Procore. So again, you can create your budget wherever you feel the most comfortable with in regards to budget creation. So what I'm looking at here is I'm in my ready to import filter by default. And so I'm looking at a list of jobs that I could potentially import the budget into Procore. Now you'll notice that a lot of these jobs actually have a $0 budget amount. This just means that I have not yet created a budget for these particular projects in Sage. Okay, so that's why the dollar amount says 0, because there's no budget for me to import. However, if I look at my project, Emilio's Restaurant, I have a budget amount that I've entered for this project in Sage, and if I want to pull this into Procore, I would just simply click Import. So the green success message lets us know this has been successfully imported into Procore. So let's go out and let's take a look at the budget for this particular project in Procore. Right, so I've just imported this particular budget in from Sage. So this very first column, the original budget amount, this is what's going to match up with the budget amount in Sage 100 Contractor. As you can see here in Procore, we break out everything by cost code and by cost type, and we'll give you a subtotal for each division on your budget. And if I scroll down to the bottom, remember this job had a phase in Sage 100 Contractor. So here's the subtotal for the main part of the job. And then if I scroll down, here's my phase or subjob, covered patio, which also has separate budget amounts. And then if I scroll down to the very bottom of the project, there's my grand total that I've imported into Procore. Now, if I scroll over, I also have a column here for job to date costs. Now, as long as your budget is synced between Sage and Procore, we will automatically pull in your job to date costs from Sage 100 Contractor about once every 30 minutes. So this column will get updated once every 30 minutes as long as we detect there's new job cost entries in Sage. Now in Procore, we don't show the transactions that make up all of the dollar amount. So what we do is we'll pull in the lump sum amount that's actually coded to each cost code and cost type. Okay. Also directly to the left of that, we have a column for direct costs. So Procore will calculate your direct cost for you. The way we do that is we take your job to date costs and we subtract out any subcontracts or purchase orders tied to an account payable invoice. So really what should be hitting your direct costs is things you guys are self-performing. For example, if you code someone's payroll time to a cost code and cost type, that's something that would typically hit the direct cost on your Procore budget. So again, both of these columns are going to get updated about once every 30 minutes as long as your budget is synced between Sage and Procore. Also, if I scroll over to the left here a little bit, we have a budget modifications column. So within Procore, you are allowed to create budget modifications. So really what a budget modification is when you've locked down the original budget amount in Procore, but maybe you want to move some money around between cost codes and cost types. So you would create your budget modification in Procore and then export that down to Sage 100 Contractor. So the budget modification is a one-way sync. So you will always create any budget modifications or moving money around between cost codes in Procore and then export them to Sage 100 Contractor. Now I'm going to go back in my list of budgets here and I'm going to go to my synced filter. So in other words, I'm going to click on this list, which is going to show me all of the budgets that are synced between Sage and Procore. So if I'm looking here, what you'll also notice is that a lot of these jobs have the re-import option grayed out. So really what this means, if the re-import option is grayed out on a synced budget, it means that this budget was created in Procore and exported to Sage. Now, the cool thing about Procore is if you see a button that's grayed out, if you hover your mouse over it, it actually tells you why the button is grayed out. It's letting us know this budget has been exported to Sage 100 and can no longer be imported. So in other words, for this particular budget, if I want to make any changes to my original budget amount, I need to make those changes in Procore and re-export the budget over to Sage. Now, conversely, if I'm looking at the project below this one, Hall of Justice, the re-import option is available. This means this budget was created in Sage and I imported it into Procore. So if I want to make any changes to my original budget amount, I need to make those changes in Sage and re-import the budget into Procore. Okay, so the rule of thumb here is wherever you actually created the original budget, that's where you want to go to revise your original budget amount and then either re-export that budget to Sage or re-import it into Procore. So just because you sync your budget, it doesn't mean that you're kind of locked into place. You can go and make changes to that budget and then either re-import it into Procore or re-export it to Sage. So next up is we'll talk commitments, which when we say commitments is really just your subcontracts and purchase orders. Now with commitments, whether it's a purchase order or a subcontract, really this is just where you're going to go to control whether or not these commitments successfully make it over to Sage. For example, here for this One Park Avenue job, I'm looking at a subcontract. Here's the schedule of values on that subcontract. Here's my reject and accept options. Now, of course, if I click reject, I can enter a reason for why I'm rejecting it. But if I think everything looks okay, I can certainly choose accept. And I want you to notice how it pre-fills the subcontract number with the same number that I gave it in Procore. So this is by design. So by default, we're always going to send it over with the same subcontractor purchase order number that you gave it in Procore. This is so it's a lot easier to reconcile the information between Sage and Procore. Now, if you wanted to, you could send this over to Sage with a different subcontract number. Now, we don't recommend that because it makes things a lot more confusing between your field and accounting staff, because your field staff is going to be looking for this particular subcontract number. However, it actually went over to Sage with this number. So again, we always recommend that you want to try to keep the numbering the same between Procore and Sage unless you have a very specific reason for doing so. So for the purpose of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to pull up my project. So there's the project that I integrated previously, High Point Furniture Factory. I'm going to go in. I think I started creating a commitment for this one already. Okay, so yep, I've started creating a purchase order and then also below that a subcontract. So I'm just going to go in and pull up the subcontract. Now, in order to send this over to Sage, I do need to enter in a schedule of values. If you'll notice, the Send to ERP button is grayed out, and it's actually telling me why the button is grayed out. It says the commitment cannot be sent to ERP because there must be at least one line item. So let's go ahead and I'll quickly just grab one line item so we can send this over to Sage. Okay, so I'm just gonna grab a particular cost code. Just for the sake of this video, I'll just grab any cost code here. Cost type, I'll just go with other, and we'll hit create. And I'll just put in slab prep. And for the amount, I'll just put $9,000. So I'm going to save that. And there's a little warning that basically says these cost codes are not yet on my budget yet. So this is just telling me it's going to add it to my budget as a non-budgeted line item. So I'm going to hit OK. Now if I scroll back up, here's my Send to ERP message. So now this button is available and I'm going to go ahead and click Send to ERP. Okay. I've clicked on Send to ERP. Now what I need to do is I need to go back out to the company level in Procore and go back into ERP integrations. Okay, so there's my list of commitments again. There is my subcontract. There's my reject and accept options. So for the purpose of this video, we're just going to click accept. It pre-filled with the same number that I gave it in Procore. And then now I'm just going to hit export to Sage 100. Okay, we've gotten the message now that this has been successfully exported down to Sage 100 Contractor. So now let's go take a look at this subcontract and see how it looks in Sage. So I'm back in Sage 100 and let's go take a look at the commitment that I just pushed over. Now I know there's a few different ways in Sage 100 to get to that particular subcontract, but just for my purpose here, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the job itself. There's my job, High Point Furniture Factory. I'm going to click on subcontracts. There's the subcontract that I just created and sent over to Sage 100 Contractor. And then I'll go ahead and click on drill down and we'll open up the subcontract itself. So now what you see, this is how we send over subcontracts from Procore over to Sage 100 Contractor. So next up, what we'll do is we'll create a subcontract change order in Procore, and then we'll also push this down to Sage as well so we can see how a subcontract change order looks when we export it from Procore down to Sage. Okay, so I'm back in my Procore company, and instead of commitments, I'm on commitment change orders. You can get there by clicking the little more drop down, and there's the option for commitment change orders, which is what I'm on right now. So if I scroll down here, I have a commitment change order set up for my project. There's my project, High Point Furniture Factory. There's the subcontract, and here is the subcontract change order. So basically what I'm doing in this change order is I'm going to add $2,500 to the original commitment. There's my reject and accept options. If I choose accept, notice how it pre-fills that change order number with the same change order number that I've given it in Procore. And then now I'm just going to click export. Now, what this is telling me is this basically wants to make sure that the commitment record is not open in Sage. Okay, so whenever you're trying to export any type of commitment change order, you want to make sure that you don't already have the record open in Sage. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, and then now we're exporting. All right, so we've gotten the message that this has been successfully exported to Sage 100 Contractor. Now we'll go have a quick look in Sage just to see how this subcontract change order looks when we export it to Sage. So I'm back in Sage. Now let's go look at that subcontract change order that I just sent over to Sage. Okay, so there's my job again. Then on subcontracts, there's my subcontract record. And notice in the changes column, there's now $2,500 listed there. And we've also got a new subcontract total. And if I click on the drill down button, so again, here's my subcontract, and here's the second line item that I added that was a subcontract change order. So we see this here in the changes column with that $2,500 dollar amount. Okay. Also, there's a different way I could get to this. I'm going to close out. Actually, let me just get that subcontract number. All right. Also, another way I could get through this is through the change orders. Okay, oh, I thought the job number was 25, but for some reason I'm not finding it here, so let me scroll down. There's my job. Okay. So I went to the last record here, and I'm on the budget and subchange details tab. And so just be aware, we are also sending this entry to the budget and subchange details tab as well when we push this commitment change order over to Sage 100 Contractor. Okay, so I just wanted you to be aware of that, and so that's why I wanted to go to this screen, just so you guys can get a complete understanding of what happens when we send over a subcontract change order from Procore down to Sage 100 Contractor. So I'm back in my Procore company, and the last portion of this integration that I want to talk about is job costs. And so really what you're going to see here with this integration, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the project that I was working on earlier, Emilio's Restaurant. So with this particular screen, what's unique about this screen, and you notice it almost looks a little similar to the budget screen in Procore with one big difference. So here's the commitment invoiced amount that we pull in from Sage 100 Contractor. So if you'll remember, the commitment invoiced amount is the amount of subcontracts or purchase orders tied to an account payable invoice in Sage 100 Contractor. The reason why that's significant is we use that information to calculate your direct costs. So again, the way that we calculate your direct cost is we take your job to date cost, which is this column, and there's the job to date cost amount. There's the commitment invoiced amount, which this is a newer job, so I don't have any account payable invoices created for this yet. So the amount here is 0, which tells me, again, the way we calculate your direct cost is we take your job to date cost and we subtract out the commitments that are tied to AP invoices. So what makes up your direct costs is going to be that equation. And so if I go back to the budget screen for this particular project, there's my direct cost column. Now, because I don't have any invoices created against it,
then I would expect my direct cost to equal my job to date cost. The reason why this is significant, let's say, for example, let's say I'm looking at my metals division. Let's say that I always sub out this particular work to someone else. So if I'm looking at my Procore budget and I see that my direct costs match my job to date costs, that's a red flag. That means if I know that I always sub this work out for someone else to do and I never self perform this, usually this is going to be an indication that the account payable invoice in Sage is not correctly tied to the subcontract or purchase order. Now, again, because this is a dummy job, I expect my job to date cost to equal my direct costs. But for those of you who may be interested in using the integration, again, this is a really great way to know if your invoices are being tied correctly to the subcontractor purchase order, because if they're not, then your direct costs are going to be off in this particular case. However, if I scroll down to the bottom here, my job to date costs match my direct cost, which is what I anticipate since this is a newer job and I don't have any account payable invoices created against it. So again, this is going to be kind of the last piece of this integration, is going in and looking at those job costs. Now, to conclude our session today, I wanted to let you know about what our development team is working on. The focus right now is bringing the feature set in alignment with the Sage 300 CRE integration. So eventually you'll have an option to sync account payable invoices, and that's right at the top of the list on as far as what our developers are working on. And then also pretty soon you'll have the ability to sync your prime contracts and prime contract change orders. So again, we really want to try to get the Sage 100 integration in parity with the Sage 300 CRE integration. Now, of course, there are some smaller items that we're working on as well, like vendor insurance syncing. But for now, I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of insight into some of the big enhancements that we're working on. So in effect, this brings us to the end of our presentation for today. And I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this video. If you have any questions about the integration, please feel free to reach out, or if you'd like to see a more detailed demo of the integration, you can feel free to reach out as well. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and again, thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this video. Take care.